Thank you very much for inviting us to present our paper. It's a real honour and a privilege, and I think it's worth saying at the beginning that although what we're doing is relatively straightforward, I think it's quite simple. We're comparing an administrative database that we've created with a similar sample in the labour force survey. The significance of the comparison, I think, is important from a practical policy perspective. As we move forward, I think we're going to increasingly rely on administrative data to make decisions about a range of things, including decisions about how we fund higher education. And for that reason alone, a comparison is an important thing to do. So without further ado, I'm going to provide a sort of brief overview, or relatively brief overview of the paper, and draw out some of the policy implications that we think we have from it. So I don't need to explain to people in this audience that administrative data is becoming ubiquitous. It's increasingly used in economic analyses, and I think it's been used in other contexts to tell us a little bit about the problems that we have when we're using survey data, and in particular looking at income in survey data. So the advantages of the administrative data are perhaps obvious. It's comprehensive, or it should be. We'll discuss that later. Longitudinal, and the measures are clear, potentially still biased, but with clear, definable measures. But I think the really important thing as we present the paper, as I present the paper, is to remember that we're not assuming that the administrative data is telling us the truth, if you like. So we're going to kind of discuss the ways in which we think there are issues with both data sets. But I think it's also important to consider the ways in which administrative data has been used and the power of administrative data when it comes to earnings in particular. As we know, there's been some fantastic work from Raj Chetty and others using tax records from the US. So I think it's on the measurement of earnings that we see the real benefits or potential benefits of administrative data. So what did we aim to do? So what we did was we created a new database. We call it the golden sample, might be graduate sample, which is a database of a combination of different data sets. And the aim of that was to look at the earnings of graduates. Why graduates? Well, there's obviously huge policy interest in how much graduates earn, not least of which because of the way that we fund higher education and concerns about what proportion of graduates would be repaying their fees. But also because we actually lack good data. We know there's been an increase in the heterogeneity of graduates' earnings as higher education has expanded. The variation in graduate earnings has increased, and we know that it varies by subject and institution, or at least we think we do, and yet the data that we have on that is quite limited. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the labour force survey. The information on institution is very limited. So labour force survey does have data on subject, but that only gives you sort of fairly high-level subject groupings, and it definitely doesn't give you enough sample size to look by institution. So what we're trying to do with this paper is compare the two data sets to then think about what that will mean when it's applied to many of the policy questions that we have, and try and reconcile it with some of the existing literature. So in terms of the literature that we might be building on, obviously we're building on the literature that's looked at the problems with measuring income, in particular in surveys. And this is very relevant for the work that we're presenting here, which is the difficulty of measuring income, particularly for those with variable income and those with low income. Even in the LFS, we've seen changes in the way that income is measured over time. Used to be, for example, weekly pay divided by usual hours, with obviously two potential sources of measurement error there. Now it's using hourly pay, but the missing rate is still very high. And when you impute for those missing people using other measures of income in the survey, you get a reduction in the proportion of people with low earnings. So we know there's an issue there, which is why I think the comparison is particularly useful. We're also building on the literature on graduate earnings, obviously. Most of that literature has used the labour force survey, and that is another compelling reason why it's the comparison with the LFS that we think is most useful to start with. So some disclaimers there from the various people who've supplied the data. And we would indeed like to express our deep gratitude both to the Student Loan Company and to HMRC for providing the data, enabling us to link it and giving us access to it, albeit under very strict conditions. So what is the data that we've created? What is this database of graduate earnings? It's a hard link database. So unlike some of the data sets that have been used in the US, for example, where the matching has been fuzzy matching, in our case, we've got a hard link, which obviously should improve the quality of the data enormously. The hard link is between the Student Loan Company database and respectively either PAYE record or a self-assessment record. So I'm just going to briefly outline those three data sets. The Student Loan Company data is from a data set which records any person who borrows to go to higher education in the UK. So in other words, you have to be England domiciled at the point of application to higher education, and you also have to obviously borrow. So during the period that we're looking at, eligibility of those eligible, about 85 to 90% borrowed from SLC. The complication with the data is that if you borrow money and after a couple of years you drop out of university and you don't graduate, you still owe the money, and we don't have information in this data set as to whether you graduate or not. So our golden sample, our graduate sample, will include dropouts. So when we talk about graduates, we're using the term a little loosely. Sorry. So obviously that's linked to people's earnings. 90% of the tax take is coming from PAYE. So the vast majority of people in our data set have a PAYE record. But we also have a link to the self-assessment record. And in line with HMRC guidance and policy, where we've got a PAYE record and a self-assessment record, the self-assessment record dominates, and that's because they think it's a more accurate total description of the person's earnings. The other thing to draw your attention to is you might be thinking that this is sort of administrative data, it's big data, we're expecting sample sizes that are huge. Well, actually we're using a 10% random subsample of the PAYE database linked to our students from the SLC. And so we end up with around about 250,000 students, or graduates, I should say. So it's smaller than you might have expected. I've given you the cohorts that we're covering there. And the really important point is that we have their earnings up to 10, 11 years after they graduate. So that's still relatively early in people's careers, but much longer than any of the other sources of data that have been used, for example, to look at graduate earnings and inform students about graduate earnings, such as the Destinations for Higher Education Leavers database. A final point is that obviously it won't have escaped your notice that the period covers the post-recession period, so that's obviously relevant. In terms of data, you can see the sample sizes there, and as I said, it's perhaps not as large as you might have expected, but nonetheless, particularly in the earlier cohorts, perfectly sizable enough to do some really interesting comparisons. Those are the numbers for the golden sample. In other words, those are the people that we're calling graduates, including some dropouts, not more than 10% of the sample for this period. So our focus is on earned income, so we're not interested in other types of income, so we're taking that as employment and self-employment and the profits from partnerships, mindful that maybe that will include some return on capital, but it's included in our measure. A no report is equated to zero earnings, and by that I mean we have a database of people who borrowed money to go to higher education, so we know who these individuals are, and some of them don't appear in the HMRC dataset for various reasons. It can be that you're not in the dataset because you're not working, or it could be that you're not in the dataset because you're moving abroad. Both of those are possibilities, and as I go through the paper, we'll try and sort of quantify the importance of those limitations on the data. But we do at least observe in our graduate sample those who theoretically we would expect to find in the HMRC record. Okay, so if we get stuck into the data, There are a couple of points that spring out from looking at the descriptive statistics. The first point is that we have a percentage, obviously, that have no tax form who are not earning, and they're earning zero earnings, and then we have the percentage who are earning less than 8,000. You might wonder why 8,000. That's because it's the approximate tax threshold above which you need to pay tax. So we think that the administrative data is likely to be a better record, a better representation of earnings above that threshold. So it was important to kind of look at what the distribution shows both below that and above that cutoff. And as you can see, we have relatively high proportions with no earnings or zero earnings. And in the paper, we spell out how that is consistent with other sources of data and how that proportion looks around about right when we look at other sources of information about the proportion of graduates with no earnings. But when it comes to the proportion earning less than 8,000, we're seeing around about a quarter of the cohort, even for those who are in their 30s with earnings less than 8,000. So we'll come back to that point. Just to summarise the sort of issues, even if before you do a comparison, we're looking at a starkly high proportion with low earnings under the 8,000. At this point, it might be that you're sitting there thinking that it could be underreporting in the administrative data. Obviously, the administrative data is a tax record, and given that you have to pay tax on it, there's an incentive to reduce your reported income. So the HMRC have done a lot of work on this and estimate that around about 25% of those filing a self-assessment underreport their income, and the gap, or the underreporting, is about 17% of the total. So that's a significant issue. They estimate it to be not zero, but fairly trivial for the PAYE individuals. And in terms of the proportion filing a self-assessment, it's relatively high. The proportion who are entirely self-employed is relatively low, but around 10% of the sample are filing a self-assessment. Okay, so we also have some information, less information, but we have some information on non-borrowers. In other words, people that we might think of as non-graduates, except for the fact that if you didn't borrow anything but you went to higher education anyway, you'd also be in this group. And they have an even starker percentage of low earners. We do need to adjust for the fact that we have got some graduates sitting in our non-graduate sample because of the issue of not borrowing. When we reweight the earnings to try and adjust for that, we still end up with a very stark proportion earning less than 8,000. So those are the descriptive statistics for what we're describing as the silver sample, in other words, the non-HE sample. And again, you can see around about a quarter this time with no earnings or no tax reform, but almost half, even of the, say, median age 31-year-olds, almost half of them earning less than 8,000. So the issue of low earnings in the graduate sample is quite major. The issue in the non-graduate sample is very significant indeed. But obviously, so far we've just described the data sets that we've created, and they're showing us some quite stark pictures that would be of interest, particularly if you're trying to understand the low end of the labour market, or the low earning end of the labour market. But what we were doing in the paper is making comparisons with the labour force survey. So we've matched on the cohort, gender, graduate status, pulled out a labour force survey sample for the same time period. We are not able to match on whether or not they were domiciled in England at the point of application to higher education, but we have restricted it to those who are currently domiciled in England. And we're using the earnings data from the LFS, obviously, and we're mindful that actually the response rate to the earnings question is only around 70%. We're including proxy earnings, but we also do the analysis with and without the proxies, and it doesn't make a massive amount of difference. And given the fact that the labour force survey is obviously much smaller sample sizes, we've pooled cohorts. So before we show you some pictures of what it actually looks like, it's worth spending a minute or two thinking about the biases that we might expect to see. So most of the biases that we would worry about are biasing things downwards for the administrative data, for the golden sample, and they're biasing things upward for the labour force survey. So, for example, the issue about the golden sample being created from a tax record would incentivise people to underreport. For the LFS, we're having to annualise earnings from shorter periods. We may be missing people who are intermittently employed, and that would mean that we're not including the lower earnings people in the LFS, and that would bias upwards. Likewise, we've already discussed dropouts and non-borrowers in the graduate sample, which will tend to bias it downwards. Also, we're having to include people who may be moving abroad and give them zero earnings because they're not filing a tax return and we don't know what they're earning abroad, and that too would tend to bias it downwards. But that is not a major source of bias, given that at any one point it's just over 1% that are abroad, and over the period around about 4% of the sample had ever lived abroad. And then finally, the treatment of self-employed differs. Obviously, in the tax record, we include them and they're recorded. The labour force survey doesn't. But again, given the proportion that are fully self-employed is very low, 3-4%, this too is not a major explanation for some of the trends that we're seeing. The final point is simply that when you ask people about income, as you know, it's very difficult. They may include things even when you're asking them for net pay, employee pension contributions being the obvious point. Okay, so what are the key differences between the administrative data and the labour force survey? The share on zero earnings is somewhat higher in the administrative data for men, but what's really different is the share on low earnings. So it's much, much higher in the administrative data. And that's what I was going to show you here. So even if you then condition on earnings above 8,000 and say we're only interested in sort of, if you like, putting on one side the very low earners where there might be issues of underreporting in the tax data because they're not above the earnings threshold, and we focus on earnings that are less than conditional above 8K, you still get to see some of these differences. In this slide, what you're looking at is the percentage earning less than 8K, but conditional on having earnings above zero. And so the key point here is if we take, for example, males 2008-9, in the labour force survey, you're looking at around about 3.2%, earning between 0 and 8,000. In the golden sample, it reaches 14%. So very, very big differences. The differences are somewhat smaller for females, but nonetheless exactly the same pattern, so that basically in the administrative sample, the golden sample, you're seeing much higher proportions on that low earnings between 0 and 8. So now going back to the point about conditional on being above 8K, LFS earnings are also higher through the distribution up to around about the 90th percentile. So we can see this in a picture in the moment, but when you actually try and quantify the gap, it's very sizable. It's extremely large at the low end, but even if you take it around the mean, LFS earnings are coming up at around 20% higher for males as compared to the administrative data, a slightly smaller gap for women. And so this picture kind of illustrates it for a particular year, 2011-2012. And just taking men for a moment, the solid black line obviously is the administrative data, the golden sample, and the dark dashed line is the male LFS sample. And you can see at the sort of 0 to 45th percentile, the gap is very large, with LFS earnings coming in at a considerably higher level. And as you move through at around about the 90th percentile, that gap disappears, and indeed the administrative data exceeds the LFS at the top end. And a somewhat less stark but nonetheless similar pattern for women.
Explain the little dots.
Oh, sorry, your jitters.
They're my favourite
Your favourite dots, yeah. So the dots on the right-hand side are giving you the means for the various samples. So male administrative data, golden sample, for example, is the solid black one. The red one for females, likewise. So that tells you the overall difference in annual earnings at the mean between the various two samples, which on the size of the graph is probably not obvious, but that relates to the comment previously about the gap for males being 20%. So in terms of possible explanations, obviously one of the most likely explanations is that lower earners, and particularly males, are not responding to the labour force survey, so they're missing, thereby overstating earnings in the labour force survey. Likewise, measurement error in the labour force survey earnings variable is likely to do a similar thing. We don't think self-employment is a major part of the story, but the final point is that we can't be sure that it's not underreporting in the administrative data. And, you know, one potential explanation as to why you might get a slight difference here, because remember that the gap between the administrative data and the labour force survey data is much greater for men. It could be that second jobs are being undertaken by men, for example, at the low end of the distribution, and they're reporting that income into the labour force survey because they're estimating their overall level of income, but they're not reporting it to the taxman. That might be one explanation. So in terms of the non-graduate comparison, bearing in mind what I said about being a little more cautious with this data, because we do know that it also includes some graduates, and although we've adjusted for that, there's still an issue. Above 8K, the difference is quite similar to the patterns that we saw in the graduate sample, which might lead us to think this is not the difference between the administrative data and the labour force survey data is not being artificially created by the way we're defining graduates or by the way we've constructed our graduate sample. It's a trend in both the graduate and the non-graduate sample. And again, we see this very stark pattern that the LFS earnings are coming up very high for males, particularly at the bottom end of the distribution. And so this is the same picture. You can notice that the jitters on the right-hand side, the gaps are slightly greater, so there's more of a discrepancy between the labour force survey and the administrative data. But the similar pattern where the LFS earnings are higher at the bottom end. But in this case, the administrative data dominates from around about the 60th percentile. So I should point out that that is conditional on earnings being above 8,000, because we've already said that we're concerned that under 8,000 there's quite a lot of messiness about people who may feel that they don't have to report their earnings because they're not eligible for tax. Here, this is what it obviously looks like if you include that group, and illustrates, you know, the very stark point that at the very bottom, when you're talking about low earners below 8K, the gaps are enormous, and there's quite a fundamental discrepancy between the labour force survey and the administrative data, and this is true for the non-graduate sample as much as the graduate sample. So what does this actually mean in terms of sort of meaningful understanding of what the gaps might imply for things that we care about and our view of the world, if you like? So the first thing we thought would be interesting to look at would be the gender pay gap, because obviously that's quite a key variable, but also because the patterns we're seeing in the discrepancies between the administrative data and the labour force survey at the low end would suggest that this might be a real issue when it comes to thinking about gender pay gap at the bottom end of the distribution. We know already, obviously, that the pay gap, the gender pay gap, is larger for non-graduates, but in the administrative data, interestingly, because of the patterns that I've just presented to you, we actually end up with a far smaller gender pay gap at the bottom of the distribution. So what this picture is showing you as you go through the percentiles is the male to female earnings ratio. Obviously, down the bottom end there, you've got the same colour scheme. So the black dark line is the administrative data, the dashed dark line is the LFS data, and this is all for graduates. And you can see that you've got very, very large gender pay gaps generally at the bottom end. That's obviously the first point to notice. But also when you look comparing, say, the dark black line and the dash black line, which is the LFS versus the administrative data, the LFS is showing much larger gender pay gaps below the 45th percentile. So what that implies is that we thought we had very large gender pay gaps at the bottom end. If you believe the administrative data, that's not necessarily true. That might be simply because low-earning males are not responding to the labour force survey in the same numbers. That's an obvious explanation. Alternatively, it could be some complicated reason why males in particular are underreporting earnings to the taxman. And the red lines are for the non-HE, the non-graduate sample. You can see a similar pattern in the sense that the gender wage gaps, the gender wage gaps are larger in the LFS data. So the other aspect that we were interested in focusing on was the graduate wage premium. Obviously, this was actually where we started the paper, which was trying to understand both graduate wages across the distribution, but also the heterogeneity in graduate wages, and trying to unpack that. So the obvious first point to look at was what the graduate wage premium looks like. We're not ascribing this causally, so this isn't an estimate necessarily of the impact of the degree on someone's earnings, but it is a useful indicator. And again, what we're seeing is that the graduate wage premium is much larger in the admin data at the bottom end of the distribution. So again, arising from the fact that low wage people or graduates are not reporting their low wages to the LFS, if that's the explanation that we think is most likely, we're seeing this larger graduate wage premium. It's large anyway, 1.8 for females, 1.5 for males, and it actually increases over the period, which is consistent in both data sets, because obviously this is the post-recession period, and the labour market got proportionately worse for the non-graduate group. So this is the graduate wage premium, so same pattern, looking at males in the dark black line. You can see it's a much higher estimate of the graduate wage premium at the bottom end. And in fact, actually, it's higher right across the piece until you get the 70th percentile for men. For women, broadly similar, but the discrepancy between the LFS and the administrative data is somewhat less. These all fall out of some of the patterns that I was describing earlier. But if we think about what we thought we knew about the world, one aspect of this that's really important is that despite seeing this heterogeneity in graduate earnings, if you're just measuring the value of higher education in a crude way using the graduate wage premium, it would appear in the administrative data at least that the benefits of higher education are much greater for the lower earners than we thought previously. And then the final sort of application of this data that we wanted to look at was a measure of inequality. Again, the focus of the project, and we've gone on to do other papers from this data set looking at heterogeneity within the graduate group, our focus was trying to understand the dispersion of graduates' earnings. Earnings inequality in both the graduate and the non-graduate group increases over this period. Again, that is probably linked to the specific nature of being post-2008. But what the consequences of some of the patterns that I've been describing is that we see much less earnings inequality in the LFS than we do in the admin data. So the administrative data is telling us both that the graduate wage premium overall is higher, it's higher at the bottom end of the earnings distribution, but actually what we're also seeing is more inequality within the graduate group if we go with the administrative data. And generally, both data sets agree that earnings inequality is much greater for non-graduates. Probably best to look at a Gini coefficient to kind of illustrate that point. So we've broken it out for males and females and for graduates and non-graduates. So if we focus just for a moment on graduate men, you can see that the Gini coefficient is substantially larger by 11 percentage points as compared to the estimate of the inequality in the labour force survey. The difference in inequality for women between the way we thought we saw the world with LFS versus the administrative data, that difference is less stark, but nonetheless the same pattern. But what's really striking, of course, is if you move over to the non-graduate group and look at the inequality there, we see that very, very different levels of inequality in that group depending on the data source. So this is obviously quite crucial. It's crucial at many different levels. For the graduate group in particular, I should have pointed out that the modelling for the repayment of higher education tuition fees has been done extensively using bits of data from the labour force survey, for example. And so if we think that actually there's more inequality in that graduate group, then the implication will be that different people will be repaying their their tuition fee loans to a different extent, and we don't really understand that fully if there's a big discrepancy between the LFS and the administrative data. So in terms of just summarising what we think the data sets are showing us and telling us, I think it's important to note that both of them are showing a relatively similar picture when it comes to people in employment, i.e. those with zero earnings. And we've done a lot of work in the paper trying to make sure that they align and that we can explain, roughly speaking, those with some earnings and make sure that they're consistent across various data sources. We've also looked at other data sources like the Family Resources Survey to check that. But what we are consistently showing is this higher share in the administrative data with earnings below 8,000, and that applies both in the graduate and the non-graduate group. And when it comes to the graduate group, essentially the labour force survey is showing higher earnings through the distribution. I think the other important point from the summary is that because we're seeing so many of the same patterns in the graduates and non-graduate group, that we don't think this is to do with our construction of the graduate sample. And what does that mean in terms of implications for research and indeed for policy? So if you think that we should at least consider weighting the administrative data more heavily in our understanding of what's going on in the graduate labour market, then we reach quite different conclusions when we use that data. And turning to the gender wage gap, for example, and finding much less gender inequality at the bottom end of the labour market is actually consistent with what we also know about some of the occupational shifts that have been happening between males and females at the bottom end of that labour market. So the real implications of this data are that we would look at the labour market differently, particularly at the bottom end. Likewise for the graduate wage premium, and I've already covered how that might have implications for higher education finance. On the inequality side, I think one of the issues is, well, there are two issues. One is, have we underestimated the amount of inequality because our measures from the survey data are not giving us, well, there are certain groups who are not included in that survey data, particularly low-earning males, and so we've got a misleading picture of the labour market. But I think even if you just focus on the administrative data, one of the questions that leaps out from this paper when you talk to policymakers about it is that the proportion of graduates having such low earnings, such a long time into their career, is really very, very striking indeed. And actually, when we first looked at the data, we kept stopping and trying to check things because it just seems quite worrying that amongst a graduate group and in their 30s or early 30s, you would see such a low level of earning. And that leads to lots of questions, and whether those questions are about tax avoidance, or whether those questions are about deregulation of the labour market, different types of employment, including gig employment and self-employment, and whether that's creeping into that bottom end of the labour market. Either way, what it is definitely going to mean is that some of our assumptions about who can repay their tuition fees are wrong. And so, I mean, I think our careful conclusion is that there are problems with both the labour force survey and indeed any survey. There are problems potentially with administrative data. We think those problems are more at the low end than above 8K, and we're still seeing differences even if you condition on it being above 8K. So given that the administrative data should be more reliable, we think that that's cause for concern, and we should do more, if you like, to work out who's missing from our surveys. And then the other obvious point, I guess, is whatever the truth, even if the administrative record is not the truth, it is the truth when it comes to repaying your tuition fees. So even if we think there's undisclosed income floating around that we don't know about, it doesn't make any difference, because actually it's that administrative tax record that the person has that will determine how much they repay. So we need to perhaps start thinking about ways of understanding, or more research and ways of understanding why people are having such low earnings, what kinds of work they're doing, and whether they are exploiting scope to underreport their earnings. So that's just the final bullet there. We think that this is sort of the start rather than the end of looking to properly explore why it is, first of all, that we have discrepancies between tax records and surveys, but that might be more obvious why. But secondly, what we can do about the large share of very low earners, even amongst our supposedly very high-skilled group, i.e. graduates. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come and give a vote of thanks on behalf of the Royal Statistical Society. So to start, my thanks to Anna for an excellent presentation, and to her co-authors, Jack Britton and Neil Shepherd, for the paper. I should say at the start, I found the paper absolutely excellent, so I'm afraid my critique is not going to be negative in some sense about what I want to say. But I think the paper is a really important piece of research, and as we've seen from Anna's presentation, it's been undertaken in a meticulous way with really great care to the detail of the data that they're working with, and I think that is really very important. So if I could just start making a few comments about what I think are the real positives of the paper, and then I'll say something else, and then finish maybe with a more general comment about returns to education in the higher education sector in the UK. So in terms of my sort of positive comments, and really highlighting what we've seen from Anna already, and it's my first point on there is about it being the actual record used to inform graduate repayment on student loans, which is the point Anna made right at the end of her presentation. I think this is the absolute important point. In terms of government, the income contingent returns on the loans, this is the data that is going to be used. So in terms of the return on those loans, this is it. So there's no question about whether it is correct or not. Even if the data isn't correct, this is what is used to repay those loans. And I think that is a really important thing to understand, both about thinking about earnings, but really in a more general sense about the system of funding of higher education in the UK at this time. Okay, in terms of what I think is really sort of very important, and this is some of the value of the work. Of course, there's been a lot of work done on this in the US already, but one of the really, really strong points about the way that the data sets have been linked is that there is a hard link between the two data sets. So the tax records and the student loans, they're matched on insurance numbers, so there's no question of a fuzzy match, it's a hard link match. And that's obviously really important for reducing any question of accuracy on that dimension. As Anna's noted, these are long panel data, so that's obviously really important for information. And although we haven't really seen it in this paper, the fact that we can identify, with the data, identify different higher education providers and also different subject areas that students will have undertaken their degrees in are really important in terms of having that subpopulation data. So that's really, really valuable. And also, as we have seen with the comparisons in quite detail with the labour force survey, having a comparison with such an important labour market survey, the labour force survey, which is used in a range of dimensions by government in terms of relating to not just education, but also other labour market, is really important in terms of validation of the data set. So I think that comparison is really important. Okay. So in terms of maybe being a little bit more critical and where I have concerns about some of issues around the data and the samples, I would say when I read the paper, I found the golden sample very interesting. I guess on some level, I found that so interesting and the data so important. I did wonder a little bit why the silver sample had to be created. In some sense, I think there was an important paper purely talking about the golden sample and the implications for the earnings of that group and for the returns on the loans, where it didn't even need to go into a silver sample to have been a really valuable piece of work. But we did have a silver sample as well, and that comparison between, if you like, degree, no degree, or borrowing, not listed as borrowing, is actually really valuable. But I had concerns going forward about the, if you like, the definition of that group. One concern being with the national insurance number for individuals who migrate to the UK, maybe in a post-Brexit world of high-skilled migration only, that sample is going to be getting increasingly full of individuals who probably are high-skilled and educated, although not in the UK. I also compare as well with the idea, I'm not familiar with the data set, but I'm assuming that anybody who has an apprenticeship would be in the silver sample compared to the gold sample. Now, if these are traditional apprenticeships where that was manual work, maybe that's not so much of a problem, but now we even have the GES professional economists apprenticeships, so you can imagine that this group of silver sample might not be quite as sort of, not the sort of non-graduate sample that we might wish it to be able to directly compare. Time periods, I mean, this has been noted very clearly in the paper and Anna, but the time periods looked at are, in some sense, the most unusual time periods to pick for the wage levels, but also the growth and paths of wages in the post-financial crisis period. And if we do believe there's any idea of scarring on wages in terms of first jobs and how that will affect future progression, actually there is a question about how representative this group might be. How helpful, so this sounds critical at the start, but how helpful is the information on other policy issues? Well, I think it is helpful. It's always interesting to have more data. I have to say I get a little bit concerned where there's a conclusion that there isn't a gender wage gap. I guess because when I think about gender gaps, I don't think about just wages. I think about gaps in labour market outcomes. And that is broader than just wage. That's a whole sort of range of factors. And interestingly, the question I would want to know really is if there isn't a gap in wages on the lower group would be how does their labour wage mobility change over time? Do we see progression from those groups? And in fact, maybe in low-skilled work or lower-skilled work, where definition of work is quite clear, the ability to pay workers different wages for equal work since the 1970s Equal Pay Act has actually reduced quite significantly. So in fact, the gender issue for the lower part of the wage distribution can manifest in other ways, which are worrying from a life cycle point of view in terms of wage growth, wage mobility, progression, and so on. So I would say that to focus on just the gender gap and say that there isn't an issue there would be, I think, would be sort of not focusing on the full issue of gender. And then the final point, which I think is worth considering, a question, is more research needed? I think if you ask any academic that, the answer is, of course, yes, we need more research. And I think there's a lot of interesting research to do here. I noticed the Family Resources Survey was used in this paper as well, which is a useful comparison with LFS. But the other big government data set is the AHSE, so the Annual Hours of the Survey of Earnings, which I think if all three were being used would provide an interesting triangulation of data to try to really understand what's going on with wages. My only fear, and I've mentioned this to Anna before, is when we're comparing, for example, this administrative data, which the government has already, in some sense, zero cost to collect, because you're collecting it anyway, my fear would be maybe sort of undervaluing LFS, which collects so much more important contextual information to understand outcomes, maybe in sort of having the government having less support for the long-term funding of that in favour of tax records, which, as we've seen, only really have one dimension that they're discussed, which is wages. Okay, so in terms of the importance of it then, I think really, as Anna said, what the paper does is to talk about the data set that is going to be used to collect the student loans, and for a government to understand the return to those loans. Obviously this data is key. So having some data is obviously good. So yes, it is good, and I think, as the quote there says, errors using inadequate data are much less than those not using data at all. But I think really the strength of the paper, and I hope government, when they read it, will understand that, is the strength of the paper. It shows the real limitations or the inadequacy of the tax records. And I think if that is understood clearly, then it is a really useful piece of information. Okay, I have to say, when I also read it, there was a lovely quote in the paper on page 6 with a phrase that says, the work was carried out in a highly secure data enclave. Now, as an academic researcher, I can't think of anything that strikes more fear into somebody's heart than the thought that they have to sit in such a facility to access this data. Now, why is that important? Seriously, though, why is it important? Because academics love data, economists love working with data. There is an incredible resource of creativity for the government to allow researchers outside of government to work with their data, and there is great value then to share with the data, as we've seen from this paper. And interestingly, I don't think it's just difficulty from external researchers using government data. Even inter-department shares is very difficult as well. And I think if you're creating this data and you've got it, not to sort of harness that excitement about working with your data to inform you about your policy, seems to be a lost opportunity. Okay, so my final points really were just about the returns to education. Now, I'm not going to suggest for one moment the economists here don't know that there are other returns, but throughout the whole paper there's a focus on really just one dimension, which is wage. And I guess I would argue that that is only one of the dimensions of interest in terms of a return to education. And I think it's especially, I should finish. I'll be really quick. Sorry. Right. Okay. But especially for economists, I think we do understand the dimensions of the returns to education for the individual, which, as somebody academic working in a higher education, I would say are transformative. They are transformative for individuals, for their lives and their future paths, and transformative not just for the individual, but for their societies. We know societies where individuals are educated, have sort of lower inequality, there's better health outcomes and so on. So I would argue from a point of view of talking about returns to education, it's a really important time for economists to think broader than just wage. There are more important factors than just earnings. And I say that as a Labour economist who, when I branch out for thinking about W, I just think about hours, which is H. So, yes. But I guess my final point, again as an academic, would be that the returns to education are not just to the individual. They are to society. And I think these are returns from the higher education. It's a nice picture of a very Hogwarts-like institution, which is, we have one building like that at York, but this is the real picture. And I think that is really what universities are about, which are about being a hub and an engine of growth in local communities, both nationally and internationally. And I think when we talk about education, we shouldn't just talk about teaching and graduates, but we need to talk about the research and the economies around those universities to have a really full consideration of what universities do. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Yes, I would like to second thanks to the authors of the report, which we found particularly interesting topic to research into, and also extremely important. From an statistics point of view, the focus within ONS and other bodies really is to consider an administrative data first, supported by surveys. So the more that we can understand about the administrative data relative to surveys, the better. It is quite a challenge, and I think it's critical to get more and more learnings from this kind of work and to get more access to the data. Even in countries where there's a lot of register information, I was at Eurostat last week, and Sweden were talking about the surveys that they're using because they can't always use administrative data for the things they want to do. So it's an ongoing issue around Europe and the rest of the world, and we are involved in a lot of positive initiatives to work with other countries. For example, we set up a methodology working group last week, which will concentrate on admin data initially. So, and I think this paper is a good reminder that it's not just about the total level of employment or wages, but it is very important to bear in mind specific groups. So graduates as being, you know, a particular group, and we have to be reminded of people like this and other subsectors of the workforce, which we have to bear in mind and dig into. About the analysis, to second what Joe said, I found that it was very accurate in terms of the coverage. My focus is going to be more on the ONS side of things. I used to manage the LFS, and now I've recently moved to earnings branch, so I'm covering ASH and annual average weekly earnings. So as we went through, everything, you know, was fitting very much with our expectations in terms of the description. But there are a couple of things which I will just pick up on and dig into a little bit more. Sorry, page down. Okay, does it work? No. Arrow, there we are. Okay, thank you. So the first thing to mention, this didn't come through strongly when I read the paper, but it's about the reference periods and just thinking about the potential impact of that, because there is quite a difference between the LFS and other surveys compared to administrative data, potentially. So for the LFS, the way that the wording works is that during, did you do any paid work in the 7 days ending last Sunday, for example? So what you're finding in there is that if people work in a regular pattern, for example, 1 week in a month, and they happen not to work in that working week, then, of course, they wouldn't be recorded as having to go through to the later questions. And the earnings questions in LFS are based on people who are working. So this whole group of irregular workers would be missed potentially. Now, the question is how big that group is. HMRC published experimental stats comparing the LFS with PAYE data, and their comparison was something like 28 million versus 26 million in terms of the number of people working. So it was about a 7 or 8% difference. They related it partly to people who were primarily self-employed who would do some additional work, who wouldn't be picked up in LFS. But they also recognised the impact of the reference period. So I think that's an area which, you know, it's interesting that maybe it didn't come through more strongly and will be an area for additional work. Just to mention for the LFS, because we monitor the representativity of the survey, because with response rates declining generally for surveys, it's very important to do this. And I thought it's worthwhile just mentioning here that one of the measures that we use is the census non-response link survey, and the point here is that when we looked at groups of people who are responding and non-responding within the LFS and the census, you actually get a very similar pattern in terms of number of people who are employed between the two. So what I think that helps us discount is to say, well, we are getting, potentially, is there a biased picture in terms of missing employed people in the LFS or missing less employed people? And that initial top line finding suggests that really isn't the case. So the second point, sorry, I've just flipped off, I'll go back. The paper referred to potentially the LFS having a skew in relation to lower paid workers, which I think is a fair point, because on any survey you might struggle at the extreme. So lower paid workers may be more disengaged generally. They may be less inclined to respond to the survey. But I think in relation to that point, that there are two important things to point out about the fieldwork for the LFS. One is that the fieldwork is done very comprehensively. So at the first wave of interview, it's done by face-to-face interviewers primarily, and they will make up to about 15 calls at a household to try and get people. And they won't concentrate it on one particular time of day, so they will focus throughout the day, so from 9 o'clock in the morning till up to 10 o'clock at night. So I think that, actually, the one point of view about potentially missing shift workers, then the design of the LFS is actually quite very good at trying to address those. And the other aspect in relation to that point about potentially missing lower earners is that you might have lower earners being more geographically mobile, but actually the LFS isn't based on individuals, it's based on addresses. So even if people are moving from one residence to another, they've got an equal probability of being selected in each wave. That's assuming that they're staying in a private residence. Now, picking up on the gender pay gap, I'm going to talk about ASH here. It was mentioned by Joe as a possible third element of stat source. In the paper, you talked about the FRS, and then you dismissed the ASH for that particular paper quite quickly for reasons which were laid out in terms of being quite similar to LFS in a number of ways, which is absolutely true. But I think for ASH, with it being a survey which is conducted about employees, but the information is collected from the employer. That differentiates it from the LFS. So any elements of error about reporting of own income due to problems with memory wouldn't apply in that situation for ASH because it was all reported from returns from their PAYE. So just to pull out the figures, I think I drew this from a combination of the gold sample and the silver sample. The ratio of women to men earning less than 8,000. So in the administrative data, it was something like 1.3 ratio, and in the LFS, it was a ratio of 4. But if we look at ASH, and I'm certainly not claiming this to be robust analysis, I'm putting it in as a kind of a talking point, really. The information is published about the percentiles. So at the 10th percentile, how much is the median pay? And this is based on weekly pay, which I think is more relevant than hourly pay because it will address the issue of some people working less often. And also taken 2009 data because I think that's around about the right period to get to people in the middle of the age group, which is reported in ASH, which is 20 to 29. So I think around about 2009, people at the start of the cohort would have been about 26, so it kind of makes sense. And what you find here is that within that age group, the 10th percentile weekly pay for males aged 22 to 29 is £205, and for females at the 20th percentile is 196. So even at the 20th percentile, it's lower than it is for men. Now, if you kind of backtrack from the 8,000 and divide by 50, you get to about £160. So, those figures are not that far away from 160. So we might take that as a kind of an approximate ratio. So if we input that ratio of 2 to 1 onto that chart, it puts us in the middle. So not saying that one is more right than the other, but just an interesting kind of another element of information which will help the consideration. And then turning to the numbers earning below 8,000 in total, this is what we had from the paper. Again, this is fairly rough calculation, but I think it was approximately 10% of people in the LFS earning less than 8,000, and in the admin data it was more like 23, 24%. For ASH, the the 10th percentile is £146, and the 20th percentile £235 at a weekly level. So if you relate that back to around about the 8,000 mark, you have to bear in mind here that this is only based on individual jobs. So a person might have 5 different jobs within ASH. So you have to bear in mind that things will move away from that a little bit. But I think 146 is pretty good estimate actually of a pretty good proxy of an £8,000 a year earning. So if we input that to the relationship between LFS and admin data, then it does pull it down towards the LFS. So which I think, from the point of view, then you have to consider, well, what would be the impact of people having additional jobs? If there are more men having additional jobs, coming back to gender pay gap, then it would push people ASH up towards the LFS. If women have more second jobs, it would push it down towards the admin data. And also you've got that element together with the self-employed consideration here in terms of how far would that push up. So I think, within that, we haven't provided any answers, but hopefully a couple of little bits of information. So it is kind of a bit of a call to say, well, actually, I think the ASH information is very useful, potentially, and it helps people to get a bit of a benchmark. Just in conclusion, again, to say thank you very much for this work. We find it extremely useful. You were able to access the LFS data from the special license, is that right? Yes, okay, good. So in that case, you would have needed to work from, you wouldn't be able to work from an individual level in terms of matching the LFS with the admin data. So that would be a case of then working with aggregates. And of course, what we're all driving for is to have this greater linking between individuals across all the different data sets. And in ONS, we have our team working to acquire as much information as possible. And when we have that information, it allows us to dig into much more detail. The LFS is a hugely valuable data source, lots of information. So then being able to look at, are there particular occupations, particular industries, particular working patterns where you can target those people and have the difference. So I think as a next step, we really look forward to that in terms of being able to dig into that, and hopefully that might identify particular cases and particular profiles where the difference has been driven. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I too enjoyed this, but I was going to talk about another dimension, and this is about actually accessing the data. One of the issues that comes up with administrative data is that nobody asked people about using their data, and in fact nobody knew that their data was going to be used unless they came to the meeting. And so this raises a question in terms of the ethics. So nobody doubts that there aren't things in place to protect harms against the people in the data, but there's another issue about respect for persons. They include in the formal definitions of ethics. Usually this just means individual informed consent for a specific piece of work. And I know there isn't informed consent for this because I'm in the data set and nobody asked me. And in fact, when I went in for my student loan originally, if there was any information about this data being used in research, this wasn't pointed out, so I wasn't informed either. And usually you would then take a different route, which did inform people and did consult views that they may have and give some kind of opportunity to opt out of the research. This isn't really practical in this sort of way, but to express an objection in another way instead. And this is important because we know one of the reasons there can be problems with income data is people don't want to tell people about it. There is some sensitivity to the data, so there is some respect due. And what you've seen is that on my behalf and everybody else's, other people have made the decision that this is a good piece of research. And the basis for that is sort of interesting. there's a sort of understanding that there's a social license for doing this research, that implicitly people think this is okay. There hasn't been any consultation done by anybody else to see if this was something that we thought was all right. And I'm bothered about this idea of social license, because we tried that about care.data, and we definitely agreed that that's not really how it works. So I went and had a look at where we would have been, because there is now quite a lot of quite good guidance about what to do, what to ask, and how to do this. And actually, it's all come up in the last 2 or 3 years since care.data, unsurprisingly. And from looking at what you've done, it's taken a while to do this, and this all emerged since you've done this. And that was quite an interesting point. But people have been talking about public benefit, it's in the Menlo report, which updated the common rule that we should have this, and legal compliance, that's all in there. But in 2013, the OECD published this report. It's all about sensors, social media, all kinds of newfangled stuff. No idea that we need something new for administrative data. But this has all emerged since, that perhaps we need consent and opt-outs and research. And in 2016, the RSS proposed a council for data ethics. In 2016, the OECD had a new report which is much more focused, that you need to be doing things, consulting representative groups, either civil society bodies, or doing citizen juries, or fancy stuff like the medical people like. And people have produced codes of conduct, and now NSDEC offers ethical consideration, not just sort of compliance about the governance of the data, but further consideration when they consider these sorts of applications. And the Europeans and some of the biosocial data has got a bit further still there. But so my point here is in 5 years, the expectations, they've actually shifted. And I would have expected a project now to have made some kind of consultation with a representative group to understand whether they had any objections about this sort of data, and made some kind of account to them and had some reference to them. And it's not there. But actually, when this was started, you bet you couldn't find anybody to give you a serious ethical review of whether this was okay. That's my expectation, which leads us with a question about, what do we do if the norms changed while we're doing the project? And we set up a special interest group on data ethics, and that's one of the things I think we need to take on, is when we do serious statistical work, we need to be aware of things changing about what we're doing. It says I've had 5 minutes, so I will stop there.
Right, so I also want to thank the authors for a really, really important and interesting paper. I just want to talk in more general terms about why it's important to access government data and link data sets together. But before I kind of give you my general comments on the paper, I just want to say why the Office for Statistics Regulation takes an interest in this area. So some of you may have come across this before, some of you may not. Basically, we're the independent regulator of all official statistics produced in the UK. What that means in practice is that we aim to enhance public confidence in the trustworthiness, quality and value of statistics produced by government. And the main tool we use to do that is a code of practice for statistics, which sets the standards for producers of official statistics. So why data linkage? Well, because data linkage is connected to those three concepts of value, quality and trustworthiness. So one of the things we want to do is improve the public value of statistics. And what we mean by public value is that the statistics answer society's questions. But many of those questions can't be answered without sharing and linking data. So a greater willingness and ability to share and link data is really important for improving the value of statistics. But quality and trustworthiness are also really important for safe and effective data linkage. So without focusing on the quality of the data, the results could be misleading. And it's also important that the people who hold the public data must demonstrate their trustworthiness by safeguarding data robustly during and after the sharing and linkage process, and also by being open to public scrutiny. So we recently carried out a review of the UK statistics system's ability to provide greater insights to linkage. So this is partly a shameless plug for the report, which we published in September. It's called Joining Up Data for Better Statistics, and I encourage you all to read it. We spoke to people from over 30 organizations, including academics, government statistics producers, analysts, independent researchers, and data experts. And what we found is a gap in terms of what's possible in terms of valuable insights from data linkage and what's currently achieved. So in other words, value is being squandered because data linkage is too hard and too rare. So we came up with 6 outcomes that we'd like to see for a safe and effective data linkage system. And I won't go through each of these in detail, but I'd like to focus on the gold one, which is about sharing and linking data to help answer society's important questions, because I think that's probably the most relevant here for the paper that's discussed this evening. Oh, that's the end of my slideshow. So I think the paper is really important because it shows that greater access to a different range of data sources creates new opportunities for answering society's questions. So as explained already, there's 3 different data sets that were combined: HMRC tax records, HMRC self-assessment databases, and student loans company records to provide insights about individual earnings. So the authors harness the power of administrative data to understand what's happening with gender pay gap, with the graduate premium, and also with earnings inequality. But crucially, these insights couldn't have come from using any single data source alone. They were generated by combining these different data sources and linking them together. One of the other things that the paper does well is to explore the strengths and weaknesses of a linked data set. So, kind of, as has already been discussed, a lot of what we know about earnings comes from government sample surveys. And as valuable as those sources are, they do have recognized limitations. So researchers are increasingly looking to administrative data to give insights and understand what's happening with earnings. But administrative data also have weaknesses, as explored by Anna and explained this evening. So, for example, there's underreporting of income from earnings for different groups. So it's really important to explore those different aspects of data quality. That comes back to my point I made earlier about not understanding data quality, or the importance of understanding data quality to know what's happening with the data. And sort of one of the other take-home messages for me is that survey data and administrative data might provide slightly different answers to the same questions, and it's really important to understand why. So data quality is a key component of that. The final point, still got a bit of time? Yep, the final point I want to make is about access to data. These contributions were made because the researchers gained access to data, and it's probably quite a difficult process to gain access. But I just want to say how important it is to get access to the data to generate insights. So that's why we're really excited about the Digital Economy Act's research provisions, which create new opportunities for giving researchers access. And academics and independent researchers provide really vital additional source of analysis outside government. So they need to have access to those data. And so we think that adds value for several reasons, because it allows researchers to define the important research questions, so those questions that society wants answers to. It also allows them to scrutinize the data, so it opens up government data for secondary analysis. And those are 2 really important aspects. So just want to finish by saying that we thought it was a really valuable contribution, and we'd like to see these kind of studies become the norm rather than the exception. Thanks.
Right, I have no slides for you to look at, so I'll just talk. I'd also like to add my thanks for this paper. I think it's really interesting to be in a position to use these sorts of administrative data sets under the appropriate conditions which we've already been talking about. And I think a lot of the benefit that you have in your particular example comes because you have this nice deterministic linkage process with the national insurance number. I can think of some small wrinkles around the edges of that, in particular around temporary national insurance numbers, but in general, I think that those are tiny in the sorts of populations you're looking at. If we were in a different position with a process for linkage that wasn't deterministic in that way, then I'd really be much more interested in how to account for what happens in terms of linkage error in those sorts of analyses. And I've talked about that in other places. The administrative data themselves are not collected specifically for statistical purposes, and that means that some of the definitions are often not perfect for the type of analysis that we'd like to do. In a perfect world, we'd be in a position where we would do more investigation of the types of measurement error and, if I can call them respondents, the way that respondents interact with administrative systems. So all this administrative data has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just arrive. A person has to fill them in somewhere. And I suspect that some of the errors that we see, some of the errors creating differences between the different sources here arise because of that bit. And there's much less opportunity, I think, to get into administrative data systems and see how they interact with people. I think with surveys we've had a much stronger view about having a questionnaire development process and testing those with people and seeing what happens. Whereas I know that there are design people who work out how to get information into administrative systems, but I don't see the outputs of those pieces as giving us the same sort of information about the same sorts of errors that arise in administrative systems. So I think there may be a case to try to do some more there. On the other hand, survey data aren't perfect either. They're also subject to a range of biases and errors. In particular, in the labour force survey example, the response rate has been declining. This is nothing different for the UK than in other places where all developed countries are seeing response rates in surveys go down substantially. But that means that there's potentially much more risk of selection effects happening in the labour force survey. And although the labour force survey methodology includes weighting and other things that try to take account of the non-response, if there's some differential non-response or some selection bias in the way that people participate in the survey that we can't get a handle on, that might be driving some of those differences as well. So I can see arguments on both sides of whether the labour force survey gets the right things and whether the administrative data gets the right things. And I found that this paper presents really interesting observations on the differences between those two approaches. And a lot of the time it's not really clear which is the best one, especially if you take these errors on both sides. So there's clearly an opportunity to follow up particular aspects, or if I was having a wish list, what can I wish for that probably will never happen? Maybe you could do a total survey error type evaluation of both an administrative source and a survey source and see how those two things go together. Roger mentioned a little earlier the link between the labour force survey and the tax information, and clearly that's the sort of thing which will give you the answers to what's really going on in there. Unfortunately, that's not a deterministic link anymore because you don't have the national insurance number in the labour force survey. So if you're going to do that sort of link, then we have to worry about the linkage errors, and we're back to where we started from a little bit. But I found this very interesting, and I think that it suggests some avenues for further investigation about the accuracy of both sources. Thank you very much.
This is from Professor Paul Allen at Imperial College London. Admin datasets are increasingly used in research, though perhaps more slowly than anticipated. Thanks therefore to the authors for this welcome addition to the literature and for sharing their experience, hopefully pour encourager les autres. David Hand recently identified many challenges in using admin data in statistical analysis. Clearly the authors had to tackle many of those. It would nevertheless have been useful to learn more about the strengths and weaknesses of the admin and financial data used here, especially as the concepts of earnings need to cope with an evolving labour market, including portfolio careers and working in the gig economy. Looking particularly at the student loan company data, how was the estimate of 85 to 90% coverage obtained, and what is known about the characteristics of graduates who do not take up a loan? This is a reminder that, contrary to the widespread view of admin data, N does not always equal all. Can the authors then say more about why they did not use the full set of HMRC admin data? They may have had a golden sample, but it is still a sample from the full set of records, which seems to run counter to the ambition of using big data sets. Finally, I'd like to comment on the utility of this analysis and specifically how far the authors see it important to address that. It seems to me that their results are effectively official statistics because they draw fully on official data. Student Loan Company is a non-departmental public body established to administer a scheme within the policy context and legislative framework laid down by the government. All official statistics should meet the test of practical utility, yet I'm left feeling that the authors have added to the supply side resources for future researchers without considering the demand side. How are their results to be communicated and used? Who are the policy audiences? What are the messages for those yet to start a course of further or higher education and consider taking out a loan? Further use of admin data research might just be encouraged if researchers are clear on the utility of the statistical analysis that they produce.
Basically, I want to sort of give it an overview and just say, I think it would have been easy to go into this project, which ultimately had aims of looking at student finances and calculating student loan costs over long-run periods. I think it would have been easy to go into that and just dive straight into that analysis without taking a second to pause and think about what the pros and cons of the administrative data are. And I think that this paper is really trying to do that and to encourage others to sort of not take administrative data as the answer in all cases, and to think carefully about what data they're using and comparing it, of course, to other sources to verify it. As Anna has outlined, we highlight that there are really important differences between the administrative and the survey data, and there are pros and cons in both cases. I think some of the applied comparisons that we do here are not perfect, as one of the points was raised about, or a couple of points were raised about the gender gap. What we were trying to do is say, well, if you're using administrative data, you get a different answer to if you're using survey data, and it's not necessarily that our administrative data is the answer, as with all of the other, or as is common with the rest of the paper, really. The point about gender wages, of course, is well taken. We're using administrative data, which is just how much you earn in a given year, so we're not able to look at wage rates. We're looking at specifically the gender pay gap. And I should also comment that we don't say that it's zero, it's more that it's smaller in the administrative data than in the survey data. Really, I think it would have been nice as a very relevant applied comparison where the administrative data is definitely what we want to look at, and that's to do the student loan cost with the survey data and with the administrative data. Unfortunately, that's quite a long-term project. That's quite hard to get it right. Neil and I are doing work on that as we speak, but clearly the findings that we have here suggest there are strong implications for those calculations, i.e. there are lots more people earning low numbers in the administrative data, which suggests that the student loan returns, so the repayments from graduates, will be lower than people would have thought using the LFS data. That's obviously really important in a world where so much of higher education is funded through graduate long-run contributions. This work highlights should be a red flag to policymakers thinking about these issues. Coming on to a couple of the specific points that are raised, I completely take the point, and as we all do, that the silver sample is not the perfect data set. We felt that it was an important contribution to have it in there because even though there are issues in that it's not hard linked to a source data set and we're taking it just from the tax records, there are still some really stark findings there that I think are an important contribution. One of those is the share of the ridiculously high share of low earners, but also the ratio of earnings between graduates and non-graduates was an important contribution of the paper, we felt. I think in future, this highlights the need to have a source data set to be able to look at non-graduates more robustly in administrative data. So things like the developments of LEO, where people are able to link national people database records to later life outcomes, that's kind of the future for looking at these kind of comparisons. What we've done here is imperfect, but it's still a valuable contribution, we feel. And kind of related to that, the recession. We're looking at a time which is unusual, but still really important. In terms of thinking about student loan contributions again, a lot of people will have been heavily affected by the recession in their student loan repayments, and this will, the point about the survey data and the administrative data having very different implications for those calculations still holds, even though that we're looking in a recession. We did try to do a bit more by saying, okay, well, let's look at 2008 and look at 2013 to see if there are any differences. For example, we thought that maybe there'd be more kind of people bouncing in and out of the labour market in 2008 than there were in 2013. But broadly speaking, our findings are robust to that. There are a few kind of more critical comments at the end. It's easier maybe to be critical in an email, but I think there are some really valid points raised. Yeah, we can provide comments about or guidance on how we calculate the share of non-borrowers. So the 85 to 90% figure, they're from student loan company records. There is remarkably little information at the moment about non-borrowers and why they're not borrowing. And that's an increasingly important question with changes to student finance, so that now people have to face much higher interest rates than they used to. So there's much more likely to be a selection problem out of student loans. And that's definitely an area for interesting future research, I think. Okay, I'll hand over to Neil.
I'd also like to add my thanks to all the discussions. It's always remarkable talking about this type of project and sharing experiences with people who have worked so hard at trying to bring different data sources together to answer important public policy questions. There was I wanted to talk about two of the comments. Tom King made this really excellent point about ethics, and that ethical standards of researchers is changing at some pace. So I just thought I'd mention the things that we went through in this project in terms of ethics. Some of our work was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and we set up for this project an advisory group to advise us on what was legitimate research questions here with an ethical dimension. We obviously we work at universities, and so we have to, when we say we're going to work on projects which involve data collected from humans, we have to report that to the university, and a committee looks at whether or not there are ethical issues which come up. This has been done, I think it was done at Cambridge before I left the UK, and it's been done at Harvard. More generally, for this kind of administrative data, Parliament collectively decides what the rules are about how this type of data can be used, and it regularly, because unusually for legislation, a lot of you will know this more than me, but HMRC is extremely tightly controlled by legislation. It doesn't have this kind of minister with a lot of flexibility. The law is very, very clearly written down so that politicians have less flexibility. And so we could only do this project if we satisfy the statutes of Parliament. And the reason why we wanted to do this project, we proposed it to HMRC, and this satisfied the statutes of Parliament. Later, there was a widening of the use of this type of administrative data in I don't know if it was passed in 2014, 2015, which allowed more people to access data. So when we talked to HMRC, we could only use this data because it was useful to HMRC. Okay, and now it's only useful. You can only use these types of data if it's got a demonstrated usefulness to various government departments. And clearly there are lots of improvements on how we can think about giving people informed consent. It's a little bit tricky about informed consent on your tax form, right? So you might say, well, I don't want to give you informed consent on your tax form, but you have to fill out a tax form because that's the law. So it's a little that's an interesting question. It would be nice to have the ethicists think about that. And it's difficult for statistical authorities to publish aggregate statistics on major things of importance, such as what's the average tax take for an individual in the United Kingdom, what's the distribution of that if people can opt out of it. So there are lots of public policy ethical questions which I'm really thrilled that you brought up, and I think it's a very complicated thing. I think we tried very hard to behave in a reasonable way in this context, but I want to thank you for bringing that up. And the question that was emailed in is really interesting. So in this paper, this is a paper which is in a series of papers from our team, and this paper was trying to document what this data can tell you and what it can't tell you, and why in future projects you might expect different answers to public policy relevant questions than if you used the labour force survey data, not because of particular econometric methods that we would use, but because some of the aspects of the data are different for different types of reasons. So we thought that there was really good academic reasons for writing out in detail this comparison with the administrative data and labour force data. And we will have in future things to say which have got pointed public policy quantification that we've done. But that wasn't so much the point of this paper. The point of this paper was to get people familiar with this type of data and why it may have some problems, why it has some advantages. And hopefully in the future, we thought that was the right scholarly thing to do. And then hopefully in the future, when we're focusing on particular public policy questions using this data, our friend from Imperial College can be happier with us because we can kind of document how this is relevant to policymakers.
There's a number of organisations that are doing various pieces in the space of ethics and use of administrative data. And we've heard that the compelling case to be able to use administrative data to address policy questions. For example, the Nuffield Foundation, which, as Neil said, funded part of this project, is setting up a body to look precisely at the issues around what can you do without explicit individual consent, but more crucially, how do you get public debate and public agreement about safe and appropriate use of data. And so even if you're not going down the route of individual conformed consent on a specific piece of administrative data, I think there's a really compelling case to be having a public discussion about what we feel is acceptable use of data. And indeed, ESRC is also supporting a research program that's using linked administrative data, or trying to get government departments to link and share data with a clear public benefit test. But that too is going to require also, alongside that work, public engagement on the issue, because without that, you mentioned care.com, I mean, those cases can arise unless we agree what is a safe and appropriate use of the data. Right.